All right, so without further ado, questions?
There you go.
I can start. I have a question for Rob, actually. Yes. So you you were mentioning let teams use the tools they want to kind of perform. I'm very pro that model. I'm finding it hard to do with such a large organization because management wants everybody under the same thing. But for the only thing I care about is speed. So, like, how would you advise me to kind of approach that in a human way?
So I think one of the so it's a little tricky for me to point to my own. What's that? I have to eat the mic? Yeah. Oh, geez. Okay. I did not know that. So I can't really just point you straight to my case. I mean this is partially having not worked at Netflix, but partially modeled after the freedom and responsibility type of mantra that they tend to espouse. So so there's that, so that it can actually scale and it can work at a larger scale. Because we've seen other companies do that. I think the other thing is having this experimentation increases just diversity of ideas, and I think the diversity of ideas is important for actually innovating. And I don't know, generally people want to innovate, and companies want to innovate, but they often don't know how or don't. Because they have something that's making money and they don't want to break it.
That's what scares me is if they force a single model, are they going to diminish a brilliant idea that's way down the chain that they're not aware of?
Right. And in my case, especially being smaller, I'm basically just leveraging the same idea of don't pre-optimize, right? Don't try and pre-optimize too early and sort of shut things down. So.
I've got a follow-up, actually. Jeff reminded me of something I wanted to ask Rob, and that is, do you... sorry, guys.
No,
there'll be more
don't
questions.
apologize to them.
How do you establish some kind of common API that different teams should follow? And by API, I mean like standards. Because when one team is using Ansible and another one is making their own, cooking up their own configuration management or making their own software while some other teams are using industry standards, like how does that work? Because I can see it being very disruptive and then hard to manage, creating technical debt and all the regular issues of sort of just separate.
So. Trying to digest the question. So is the question mostly just how do you manage having a
freedom,
diverse...
Freedom is dangerous sometimes.
Especially from a cost perspective. When I looked at the model of what tools you were using, the first thing that came to my mind was, wow, who's responsible for the budget on
Well, actually,
these guys have some great content.
That could work out for the best because often GitHub Enterprise, like if you use like really small team sizes, then it's really cheap.
Yes.
And they get you on the larger ones, right?
So the first question, I believe, is like how do you manage the diversity of tools and not sort of shoot yourself in the foot or just because you have this diverse array of things that people are using. Honestly, the only place that this gets a little bit tricky is when we go and change the teams. So when we have teams that are in place and they're managing their own stuff, so they know what things that they have and they know how to manage those things. When we say dissolve a team or we combine a couple of teams, now we have to merge a few things together. We've done some of that and we haven't actually seen any problems with this. So this is just kind of back to I'm trying not to pre-optimize. I'm trying to just sort of let things go. We do use, I guess Ansible and Terraform tend to be the two ways that we provision things right now. Except for Bash. I mean, we have a pile of Bash. Yeah, so that it just doesn't really get in the way.
But what I mean is, do you have some common standards that help create these APIs that are more common, so that
No.
so it's easier to use these different tools?
So sorry, so the question is do we have some common like API or some common base of stuff? And I guess my initial reaction is no, but that's not entirely true, because we do have, for example, we have one team that runs a DCOS cluster, and they definitely have people running services or teams running services on that cluster, which isn't their cluster, and so that's a kind of common infrastructure piece that they own and manage. But others are really responsible for monitoring and paying attention to their services if they're running in there. And they just realize that they're dependent on like that cluster being operational and knowing how to get to it. So there are some things that do get leveraged across teams, and they do use like common things, and we certainly have, everyone has access to all of the repos. I guess if there was one kind of gold standard that we're not 100% subscribed to, meaning that we definitely have some debt in places, but the one standard would be is that everything should be kind of coded infrastructure. Like we shouldn't just have like loose infrastructure running around with basically no code behind it and no test behind the code. So that's kind of the standard that we shoot for, but it's always a work in progress. On the cost question, so I'm basically responsible for keeping track of the cost, but I do tend to push that down to the teams as well. And right now, a lot of this is, again, don't pre-optimize, look at the cost and see what happens. And so, for example, right now, we don't like host our own, for Terraform specifically, we actually are using Atlas, which is the HashiCorp product, and I'm expecting that cost to actually get high. And when it does, then we'll deal with it. But right now, it hasn't been high at all. So it just hasn't been a problem, and it's actually been a nice tool to use. So we definitely like tools, especially. We prefer vendors that scale with us. So, for example, we've moved a bunch of our infrastructure in AWS to serverless, like using Kinesis streams to process clicks, and then using Lambdas to pull things off of those. And the nice thing there is that we can be as low as, say, 500 clicks a minute in the low period of the day, and go up as high as like 3,000-4,000 clicks a minute during the day, and we don't have to put together a ton of infrastructure to scale that. So we're really trying to leverage our vendors as best we can, and get pricing models that scale, basically with the scale.
So one of the things that I'm hearing here is that traditionally there's been this idea that we need to sort of like control and standardize to optimize costs, to minimize switching costs if people switch between teams, which is somewhat of an optimizing for the non-standard case, perhaps. And part of what I'm hearing from Rob is that let's just like steer and react and sort of go with the flow of it. And one of the essential elements there, if you look at the control model, it's typically been also, we need this control because we're siloing all these groups off. But if you have the collaboration that everybody's talking about, you have this ability to, what I've found a lot of the time is that best practices tend to sort of converge and sort of weave around each other anyway, because people are like, oh, these guys are really effective, let's do what they're doing, or let's learn what they're learning. And if you sort of steer it by outcomes rather than telling people how to do it, and you have the collaboration to get that cross-pollination, it works better. And I'm wondering, with each of the talks, like some of this goes, there's a certain amount of that has to be done within the framework of whatever the organization's maturity is. There's a certain amount of that has to do with the way people talk to each other and collaborate with each other and break down the silos. And I'm wondering, it seems like there's almost a spectrum between the speakers of like this range of degree of control versus freeform, it'll work out anyway. And I'm wondering what each of you sort of think about that within the context of your talks.
I believe I'm done.
Are we perfectly equidistant from each other? Let's present that idea.
Actually, I think
I think
to
we
be
need
all
to
the way
move
on the side, like
more.
IBM's got you by a couple of people.
Yeah, started with Blue Box.
So it's interesting for us because we view ourselves still as not necessarily a startup. We can't call ourselves that anymore, but we try to be the nimble infrastructure where we motivate ourselves based on outcomes. We feel that the only way to change IBM, because we already lost at this when coming in, by telling them, hey, this is how we do things and how we're awesome, and they said we don't care. Okay. So now it is all outcome based. Basically, we motivate ourselves and our teams by delivering the best thing possible while still generally enjoying ourselves and everything we do deliver to showcase what is possible. Because I think that's the biggest thing that we run up against is we employ a lot of engineers, obviously. They generally don't come to events like this. They don't talk. They're very much in the bubble, even within their own teams or within the company if they do get out of it. Whereas most of our engineering at Blue Box is constantly trying to find the outcomes and the decisions and impact that other people are doing. Basically, we like to learn from other people and not just having to learn from ourselves. That's the Stark approach. So who is next on your continuum then? Because I think you have a better perspective than I do.
Well, I think we had different samples. You know,
Okay.
like I think there's elements, for example, of what Laura said about maturity in this as
Yeah,
well.
going to Laura and then to Jeff, I think would be interesting.
Sure. So to clarify too, I think part of not showing what my and the people that I worked with, the model that we put together is that I feel like it is organization specific, just like first and foremost. But I also will note that a lot of the advanced column for the sections and subsections was essentially different ways of saying continuous improvement. So it's a model, it's a framework, but it's not a prescriptive one. And so that's sort of where I fall with that.
Tom's like,
He's the smallest, so he's got to go last.
So you mentioned tickets and why we do a ticket for everything. We're growing so fast that we need a quantifiable measurement of the work that the team's doing. And to follow that method, we would hire 5,000 people and it would work, and then we'd have 4,000 of them standing around doing nothing after a year. So we found that there's the theory of constraints basically says there's always going to be something. The ticketing system can't be the constraint. It has to be, something else there to be the constraint, whether it's the code or the deployment of that nature. So we have our own in-house built ticketing system for the ease of click a button, here's your ticket. Click a button, here's your ticket. It, restfully pass information back and forth, but we have to have the visual transparency to see what people are doing to know how many people we have to hire before Cyber Monday.
Nobody wants to talk about sales and marketing.
Well, no, I actually have a question for Tom, because the model that you have set up, and honestly, like I've been, following ThreatStack for a while, and for engineers, it's unbelievable in my mind how you guys reach into other areas. Internally, what are you looking for? Because first off, to find DevOps engineers is difficult enough. But to find the type of personality traits that you guys look for to be able to get out there and be outward spoken, how are you guys doing that? Or is there a system internally at ThreatStack that you're I'm curious. It's one of those things. Like first, outward engineers in the world we're in. It's like an oxymoron. So how are you guys doing this, and how are you going to scale from this point on?
So how do we recruit engineers at ThreatStack? We sometimes like to call it the long con. We have people that we know that we've met, and we've cultivated relationships with people literally for years. So it's not uncommon for us to, two of us came in, and it was like we were known to the organization a year or two earlier. And it's like, okay, and we're just gonna, and so people basically waited for us to actually be free And then, okay, once you're free, we're gonna try and snatch you up, and we're gonna try and get you to work here. But it's a matter of just cultivating that long list and meeting as many people as possible, and saying, all right, when this person starts getting a little antsy in their current job, once they've cashed out from like IBM or something like that, let's talk to them about a position. It's a long process. It's very hard to just hire somebody on the spot. So that's, again, we try and keep a large stable of people that we know and that we can bring into the organization when they're ready.
So a follow-up question quickly. Do you have would you consider ThreatStack has a great model for teaching and learning, bringing engineers who maybe don't have these skill sets, but they can come in and not only advance their engineering expertise, but also their interpersonal to be able to get into sales and marketing? Is that available at ThreatStack?
We could probably do a better job formalizing it. No, it's true. I mean, we have a few people that are just used to doing this sort of stuff, used to being out public and speaking, that have kind of just like laid the groundwork and set the way and set the example for other people to follow. But yeah, we could actually, I think, do a slightly better job. I think actually one of the things I've pushed marketing for is have a writing class. I would literally love a writing class. Like once every 6 months, just get a few of us and just help us understand how to better write, and so that we can produce better content. Something we're going to do soon is our business development reps. We need to have them better able to understand how to use social media to make new contacts. That's going to be me standing in front of a bunch of BDRs and going through a nice presentation of teaching them how do you understand, how do you use this tool effectively. But nothing so much formally. We're not particularly big, but hopefully over time we'll be able to have some nice blog post about how we're a presentation culture or something like that, where we expect engineers to do that. I don't know if that's what we're gonna do, but maybe that is something we can do as we mature.
So I also have a follow-up question. That at the risk of turning this into something about staffing and recruiting, which maybe we should have an entirely separate event about. If you are playing this quote-unquote long con and basically recruiting people that what steps do you then take to to ward off the impulse to hire a very homogenous group of people?
How do we, and you already announced it because you were talking into it. I will admit that is an issue. I go out to a number of events. I think a fair amount of people see me out at a various number of events. It's hard. It is tremendously hard. I tried with the Women in Infrastructure group.
Nobody's here.
Tom's just poison here. He's planting seeds.
So I tried with them. That was actually a dead end. This was a group that I reached out to, and I'm like, hey, here, so forth. There are other organizations in the city. So as Gwen was pointing out, Smarter in the City, it's a non-equity startup accelerator that's serving underserved areas of Boston. I'll be volunteering there on a regular basis. There's Resilient Coders. That's another organization you can get involved with. So it's a matter of us, so probably pretty much breaking out of the usual infrastructure and development groups and looking for these other ones that do exist out there. But yes, you have to work a little bit, and you have to make sure that you're going to these sort of events to find people.
Thank you.
Over here, Nick, real quick.
Yeah. So I want to come back to the question of sort of team composition. I mean, we had two diametrically opposed positions put from the platform. Laura spoke about an anti-pattern that I've used myself several times of developing a specific DevOps team. I think in certain infrastructure it has its place where you're trying to basically advocate a DevOps position between two teams. And then INET Media spoke about doing away with ops and QA altogether. And the speaker avoided the term no ops, which Netflix caused a shitstorm over when they introduced it. I think one of the reasons why Netflix caused a shitstorm is because they have probably one of the biggest operations teams of any tech company, but they put them under development. But I think the question is, how do you, like, if you do away with these various teams and integrate everyone into one big thing, there's still responsibilities and there's still technical skills involved. So how do you ensure that because to my mind, I was a late adopter of the term DevOps because I'm at 30 years since I've been. I was like, what the hell is all this DevOps about? I've been going into places and kicking down walls for years and I don't need all this shit about, collaboration, company art and all this, we don't need this, we just go in and kick down walls. So I was a late adopter of the term DevOps and now it's become a thing, no one can avoid it. But it needs to be defined what it actually means, because it certainly doesn't mean no ops. It certainly doesn't mean doing away with operational skills. And lately, actually, I was at a QA meetup recently, where the whole talk was about how do QA engineers reinvent themselves as DevOps engineers. And to me, that's a non-starter as well. There is a specific QA skill set. You have to have QA people, you have to have ops people. How you organize them as a team, that's a tactical question. But having those skill sets is a strategical question for the success of the company. So I'd like to know the panel view on that.
No, that's fine. Okay, so I don't know how many. So basically, I think the question is mostly about how do we deal with the, maintaining the skill sets of both QA, traditional QA, or I don't know, depends what you mean by QA, and having even the traditional sysadmin. Well, the code's clean. Yeah, and so I'll try not to tangent this too far down, in terms of beliefs of, should the same person that wrote the code test the code? No. See, and we can talk some other time because that's a whole other rant. So basically, engineers, the trickier one, to be honest, seems to be the operational skills and doing that sort of thing. Because basically engineers that we hire, and we tend to be doing as much test driven as we can anyways. So we do a lot of testing at different levels of testing. So the whole, test pyramid of things. And we also do either a lot of pair programming or mob programming or whatever. So there's a good constant, feedback across the entire team. So the entire team is sort of picking up the same skills. I'm mostly really trying to leverage a lot of the sort of vendor relationships, basically using vendors and vendor tools to really help out with the operations side, because we get a lot of information from them, and and having AWS in coming into the office every other week or every week is also helpful because anybody can go and ask them. The biggest thing that's really still kind of a motivating factor, I think, for most teams, is that everybody on the team is on PagerDuty. So it's really your incentive is there to understand what it is that you have to manage.
Trying to think back to your original question, Mick. So I did try to address this somewhat in the homogeneous organization when I spoke about the different team leads that I work with and their different skill sets, and specifically the knowledge bases that they can bring to the solution all the time. Coming from the software and internal IBM knowledge to OpenStack specific to the legacy platforms. We consider ourselves an operations group, less so than an engineering, and that's generally how IBM has seen us. So one of the things that I specifically have done, we hire a lot of, IBM specifically hires a lot of college grads. These guys are wicked smart. They've got like masters in comp sci. They can solve any problem I throw at them, but they don't know operations. So one of the biggest things I've done is with my engineers and what they're now doing with other engineers is mentoring, specifically from an operations perspective. So I strongly believe in growing the engineer that you want to hire because I can't hire them. There's no way I can pay them enough. I can't do the long con because this guy's already doing it. And I don't really want to. Like, I want to actually create a larger talent market and talent pool available to everyone. And if I can't keep them at my company, that's another problem I have to solve. But I want them to have the skill sets that they can have the opportunity to move on, because that means I've done my job and my team while they're with me will be better.
So let's get Jeff's.
So I'm the polar opposite. We are a large enterprise, but I guess the stigma is you can't be a DevOps shop when you have that amount of people, and I disagree. I've worked at both that are hugely monolithic, and I've worked at ones, particularly where I am now, where you are, from a bird's eye view, it does look like silos, but it is a DevOps shop. And kind of the first mentality would be is have the group build an automation platform to be able to handle a huge mass of growth. That's the first mentality I think that the team looks for, because you're building something that affects everybody else, and you're not going to be able to build that to serve yourself. You're going to have to build it for people that need to use it. So we'll start with that, especially for the operations side. For the other side, we actually will kind of merge teams or swap individual members of teams. So if we have a member that's strictly, say, a DBA, we'll put him on the infrastructure team for a month. They act as like a liaison for that team, then go back to the DBA team and say, holy shit, you got to see what these guys are doing, you know, and just spread the word. But actually having them part of the team with blood in the game, that really does eventually help.
Right, can I just follow up? So, very quickly.
Okay. All right. Quickly.
So, what you're talking about is what we used to call, back in the day, we used to call it holidaying or hotelling. You go and sit people with different teams, and it's very effective. What I'm talking about, so the question of automation comes up a lot in DevOps, but the question for me is, what are you actually automating? How do you maintain? My big thing is, how do you maintain the operational skill set in what you're doing? Because I'm a passionate believer that DevOps doesn't mean that developers can do operations. They don't know what they're doing in the vast majority of cases. And they need operational people, they need seasoned sysadmins who have an understanding of network security, who have an understanding of all these outlying things that developers by their nature shouldn't have to think about and don't think about when they're writing their code. That needs to be brought into the equation. So my question was around how do you maintain that?
So say you have a new code deployment, you need a new machine. You don't want to depend on somebody to deploy that machine. Would you rather deploy the code and have the system realize this machine doesn't exist, let me deploy the machine for him first, and then push the code there? My team would build that process, because that's the mentality that they have. We know how to build machines, but we also know how to write code to build machines. That way, a year from now, like since January 1st, we've built 800 machines with a team of 10 people. We're not doing it by hand. So we're maintaining the robots that build the machines.
I guess what I wanted to ask is, we haven't heard from a lot of you how your organizational leadership actually influenced the processes that you were talking about implementing. So if anyone has any feedback on that, how that fed in, whether it was pro or con, I mean, what was the interaction with your leadership that made what you were doing successful?
All right, I'll take it. I don't care. This one's easy. So for me, we actually internally, it's about 100 people or so, the company, so it's relatively small. And actually, most of the stuff that I'm talking about, I mean, I'm one of the, one of the implementers, but I'm actually not the person who dreamed up, like, this is what we should do. It's actually the leaders of the organization, specifically our CTO, and VP at the time. I think they were probably very instrumental, but definitely the founders are like 100% into it. And one thing that's nicely unique compared to other places I've worked is that we're actually very transparent about a lot of internal things throughout like the entire company. Like for example, everybody gets an email every morning that basically tells them how much revenue we made yesterday, and so everybody in the company is kind of all very focused around watching those lines and sort of just sharing in general in terms of information. So that's pretty open. And just as like other sideline examples that go along with this that came from leadership, we don't have an HR department. We have a people team because a lot of people talk about it like they're not resources, they're people, and so we're actually pushing through that. And we really try really hard too. I mean, the diversity problem and not having a monoculture is challenging in this industry, period. But we're trying to do what we can there as well. So.
All right, 2 more questions.
No interaction with leadership and collaboration.
Let's go right here and then just Bart.
Your leadership is involved.
So one question I had regarding tool selection. Rob, you had mentioned that teams were within, I'm assuming within some sort of reason, allowed to choose whichever tools in their workflow that worked for best. We, as somewhat of an uncontrolled experiment about 2 to 3 years ago now, attempted the same thing. And what we really ended up with was one team using, just for communication tools, for instance, we had one team using AIM, one team using Office Communicator, one team using Slack, one team using Chat, one team using Campfire, one team using IRC. There were 8 at our peak. I forget what the other 2 were.
Sure.
What we actually found was that kind of freedom enforced silos rather than broke them down. The same thing happened with our ticketing systems, where at peak we had, I forget the exact number, some teams were using Jira, some teams were using Rally, some teams were using the GitHub issue tracker. And what would happen is when one team assigned an issue to another team, if those 2 teams were not using matching issue trackers, those issues would become black hole. My question, I guess, is what do you do to make an experiment like that work so that 2 teams who are not using compatible tools can still interact, can still have visibility, and still have the ability to communicate between each other?
I guess in one respect we're pretty lucky in that that like Slack is definitely the chosen tool. So in terms of a like Campfire versus HipChat versus, like, I could see that would be somewhat complicated, and also sort of enforcing silos. So probably growing from a solid base in that case was good. And I don't know, probably a lot of people might not like the answer relating to like ticketing systems. So to me, I'm probably just old school when it comes to Agile and things like that. And to me, firing a ticket and expecting it to go to some other team, I would rather it black holed if you stuck it in a system. Sorry, no offense. But really, it comes down to communication, and I guess that's kind of the topic of the evening. You need to talk to somebody to make sure they understand this ticket in the first place, in my, I guess, limited perspective.
I actually think that too.
Yeah.
So what was interesting about your question is, and the tools that you outlined, was specifically around, those were all tools used for communication. So it seems like all the companies that I've talked to, and like Boston companies like HubSpot and others who have tried the pick your own tooling, and I think Brightcode's even done this, if all of your communication mediums are standardized, so you can all speak the same language, speak the same way, even if it's not the same language, time zones, whatever, edge cases, hopefully. The tooling of actually running in production, I think this is kind of what you were referring to, is your teams can choose the language and like how they're doing things, but they're still using the same communication mediums, which then facilitates the choice where it counts.
Yeah, and we just don't use ticketing as a communication mean. Yeah, it's just, yeah.
I think you just hit an important caveat. Don't use ticketing as a communication.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what I was alluding to, and that is certainly my preference, and I guess that seems to be the way we go.
Last question for Bart, do you have?
Sure. So I get, tonight's forum is clearly about response
team collaboration, right? Honestly, hands up to Dave et al. Who put up the conference a couple weeks ago at the DevOps Days. One of my favorite talks was Elliot Murphy from Kindly Ops, which actually kicked off the conference, right? Talked about how, I won't re-give his talk, but silos aren't necessarily bad. What's bad, maybe in our perception, is how we talk to each other, right? And tonight's talk is clearly about how do we talk to each other. I personally, my personal view is that we need QA, we need operations, we need developers, we need security. Everyone has a different kind of task at hand, so that you don't have conflict of interest, right? And I guess I just like each person to kind of answer. I hear a lot of hey, we're kind of reducing headcount, we're wearing a lot of hats, but deal with that question of conflict of interest. Because if I'm writing the code and I'm tasked with guaranteeing that it's safe and I'm guaranteeing that it's operable, who's checking? Who's actually who has a stake in saying, you know what, maybe you don't know what you're doing. Right. So can the panel go around and speak to that?
I've already answered this. I mean, to me, I don't actually I guess the idea around there being a conflict of interest, I don't actually believe to be true. I think that's fundamentally flawed, and so to me, it's like we're generally all in this together, and that kind of comes back to everybody in the company watching the bottom line and trying to push the ball forward and really drive what we do.
What's the size of your company?
It's like 100 people. Yeah, so it's relatively small.
So they say that it's about 150 people when that starts at shift.
That could be.
Yeah, well, I can't speak to that. That's why.
I've worked in companies certainly that are a lot bigger than this, but of course we didn't have this model, right? I've certainly pushed similar ideas, and certainly around the QA thing, even in very large organizations, I've coached work like that before too.
A lot of organizations I haven't seen QA handled particularly well.
Well, the idea is to have the conversation before you're even pushing code, right? And that's.
But also this idea of like you can't have the whatever fox watching the hen house kind of thing. I really feel that that's a myth. That putting the two resources together is how you get collaboration, and collaboration is what causes.
I was saying that you should have silos. Elliot's talk was about keeping silos but fixing communication.
Yeah, and so if it's two developers that are testing and pushing code.
QA and developers and AppSec and
the whole idea of concept of subject matter experts within their fields and how that collaboration happens, because somebody who's creating the code is going to be, and they're phenomenal at creating code.
They're tasked with creating.
Yeah, and I think that the mentorship model that you spoke to is really kind of like you want a diverse lineup as much as possible. I mean, this is why we want to go with diversity in the organization in general, and it's not just about gender. It's also about skill sets and just like what else are you bringing to the table when we try and hire the next person. But then having that, having everybody sort of participate in sharing like their way of doing stuff and helping others also learn that skill set and sort of distribute it. And so we're really trying to push we're just trying to push where we can to make that actually more effective.
So coming from an organization with 330,000 people, it's slightly different. So we have our engineers. There's the theory that I subscribe to of mentoring and building people. Security is not a strong point of mine. The security isn't really a strong point of anybody on my team. It is from an operations perspective. but we actually have a compliance officer who works with us closely for our entire Blue Box division. He's backed up by other compliance people, and then we have the entire IBM security division. If we ever have a breach or something, IBM security rolls in, and that's how it works.
And how's the communication channel?
Security itself is generally as needed.
No, this other entity that you just spoke to.
Compliance is generally around an architectural review. Most of our stuff for SMEs like that is reviews in describing from the engineers how we're doing something.
So after action, kind of not
Not entirely. Some
phase or?
retroactive from security, yes. Compliance is not. It's all forward. So right now we're doing a migration out of one data center into another, and so we've had numerous calls with this compliance officer describing how we're designing systems, the firewalls, and the zoning essentially required in the new system, and making sure that it still follows our compliance. And they understand all that's required by PCI, HIPAA, FedRAMP. That's not information that we need to know, but we need to understand how it impacts us, and that's how they translate. And because
have you found that those conversations were kind of in the beginning planning phases, or were they kind of, hey, now that you built something, now you need to rebuild it?
More reactive.
in general, we're usually a reactive organization that mostly believes in code first. So we will have code for idea to make sure that actually is possible or it does make sense, and then we can go through the other process. It comes through an expense, not just in cost, but also in time. Engaging those other parties is very time heavy, where you end up on conference calls of 25 plus people. Yeah, and you're essentially lighting money on fire at that point, so we try to avoid that.
So to answer your question very broadly, I feel like you're speaking to several things. One is organizational size, and then the other is organizational type. So for example, do you have a command and control organization, right? Or do you have one that really is more democratic and more bottom up? And I can't answer that question, or what, and to some extent you're talking about industries too, because industries then carry those histories. So I don't know, like what specifically then?
Well, I was just curious about your personal experience.
Yeah, my personal experience. So my personal experience is that I don't know if people were around for Igor's. He gave a talk before a panel where he talked about sort of like T-shaped employees versus, and it reminds me of that, where, a specializing generalist, and that depending on the type of company you're in, I would say that as an industry, we're moving more toward a specializing generalist model, whereas we came from more of a completely specialist or completely generalist model. But a lot of this is also values, right? So we're talking about organizational values and then how you as an individual fit into that organization and whether or not your values conform to the company's.
The 60-40 concept, I like it. All right, hey, that's it. Thank you so much. Give a round of applause to want to thank Acquia and James back here. James, step forward for getting this all set up. Thank you. And we will post not only thanks to Anastas right here, give a round of applause for videoing it. We're going to have the video streams for everybody when we're sending it out. And I'll also provide all contact information to our panelists and presenters. So if you have any extra questions that you want to do a sidebar on, you'll have their contact information to do that. So thank you so much, everyone, for participating. Thank you, attendees. Really appreciate your time. Looking forward to the next event. Thank you very much.